Welcome to Learning React with me. In this video, I'm going to talk about higher order components in React. A higher order component is nothing but a function which takes another component as a parameter and returns a new component. This is an advanced concept in React for reusing the component logic. Higher order components are similar to higher order functions in JavaScript. I have created a separate video in JavaScript interview questions playlist where I covered higher order functions in detail with examples. I recommend you to watch that video to understand this concept better. You can find the link in description. Coming back to our topic, higher order function is often referred to as HOC. Let's try to understand how HOCs will be helpful in reusing the code. I will create a component called click counter, and I want this component to display the value of count and a button that would increment the value of this count variable by 1 every time I click on this button. Let's start creating that component. I will create a functional component with name click counter. And let's export this click counter. This component will return some HTML where we will display the value of a variable by name count, and I will have a button which says click counter. So I need a state variable to hold this count value, count, and a method to set the value of count using useState. This will be initially set to 0. Now, to increment the value of this count variable, every time I click on the button, I need to add an event called onClick, which would call some method. So let's create that method first. I will call this method as increment count. This method would simply call setCount, which would check for the previous count value and increment it by 1. Let's call this increment count in the onClick event. Our click counter component is ready. So let me export. This is already exported. Let's just import it in app.js. Let's save it. useState. Okay, let me just import useState from React library. Now I have the value of count which is initially set to 0, and there is a button which says click counter, which if I click it would increment the value of count. So we have the click counter ready, and I might have some requirement where I want this button to increment the value of count when I mouse over on it. So let me create another component called mouse over counter. Import React from React library and create a functional component which is called as mouse over counter. Export this component. This will return a HTML which would display the value of count and a button which would increment the value of counter, and this button will have the text mouse over counter. And let's create the state const count set count equals use state. This will initially have the value 0. And let's create a method called increment count. This will call set count, and this will also check for the previous value of count and increment it by 1. Let's call this method in the button event. So here I wanted to increment or call this method whenever we mouse over on this button. So instead of on click event, which we used in the previous component, we'll use on mouse over event. On mouse over event. So our mouse over counter is complete, and let's just import it here. Let's save it, and mouse over, it's not imported. Let me just add the import statement. So now we have two buttons. One is coming from click counter and the other is coming from mouse over. Let me just refresh. So initially they are set to 0. So in the first one, if I click, it would increment the value of count. On the second button, if I just mouse over, if I just place the mouse on this counter, on this button, it would just increment the value of count. If I place it again, it would just increment it. So due to some requirement, we have created it in two separate components. And look at this code. We have a state variable using use state initialized to value 0. And even here we have the state variable initialized to value 0. And we have a method to increment the state. Here also we have a method to increment the count value. And in the HTML we have the code to display the count. Here also we are doing the same. And then we have a button which has some text and which would call this method. Here also we have the button which would call some method. But the only difference is this button. Other than that, everything is same in both of these components. So why do we have to repeat this in two different components? Can't we put it in a generalized location which can be utilized by multiple components? Yes, we can, because in future, if I have another function called decrement count, I have to add it here. And if it is expected to be applied for the mouse over component as well, I have to add that method here. So it would be a repetition of the logic. So we are repeating ourselves and repeating our code in multiple components, which is not a good practice. So in order to avoid that, React has provided us with a concept called higher order component. As discussed in the initial as I mentioned in the definition, higher order component is nothing but a function which would do some logic on some component and return a new component with the enhanced features. So let's try to see how we can create a higher order component to reuse the logic and apply that reusable code to these two components. So let me just create a file called withCounter.js here. So as I said, it is a function. So let me just create a function which says withCounter. And what else did I mention? This function will accept a component as a input. So what is the component here? I will just name it as original component. So whatever parameter is coming to this original component is nothing but some other component which would like to use the code provided by this withCounter function. If I have to use this function anywhere else in our application, we have to export it. So I'll just export it, export default withCounter. Now, what is this function expected to do? It is expected to perform some logic on the original component and return the new component. But what is a new component? So let me just create a new component inside it, and this component can be a class-based component or a functional component. In our example, I'll create a functional component. So I'll just say const new component equals, and this component, what are we trying to do here is, let me just update this name here. So this okay, let me just first return new component. We have a function that accepts some component as input, performs some logic, and creates a new component, performs some logic, and returns that new component. So let's try to add that logic here. What are we trying to achieve here? We are trying to move this redundant code to a generalized location. So let me just bring this code here inside this new component. Now, and what else is common here? This display part is common. So let me just bring this here. We'll just return this HTML, the common HTML. Now we have the common code extracted. What else do we have to make sure? This new component should be able to display whatever original component has, right? So I'll just render the original component, and this original component should have access to this increment count method. So how do we pass methods or data from one component to another component? Using probs, right? So let me create a prob called increment, which would pass the reference of this increment count method. Now we have the higher order component ready. This logic should be performed inside the new component. Now our higher order component is ready. Let's try to see how to use this higher order component in click counter and mouse over counter. So our goal is to remove this redundant code. So let's just remove this. But I want this increment count to be available here, and also this count value should be displayed, but it should come from higher order component. So in order to use higher order component, first import with counter and wrap this export with counter. So what we are basically doing is, we have a function and we are calling that function here, and the parameter to that function is a component. In our case, it is click counter component. So with counter, with a click counter as parameter, we'll go here. It will add the state and increment count method and return this HTML. So what it is returning here now? A new component. So let's make use of the properties of the new component. So here we'll receive some props, and instead of increment count, we'll just say props dot increment, because here increment is passed as prop. Now I am accessing that increment method using props. And why are we not seeing the component here? Okay, we did not define import use state in the HOC. So let me just import use state from React library and save it. If we refresh, the error will be gone. Let's see if our click counter is working fine. I'll just click on this click counter method and I see the count value incremented by 1. So we have made use of the generic code coming from higher order component and made this component simple. Now let's apply the same for mouse over component as well. I am removing the redundant code and the count value from HTML. Now we don't have access to increment count. It has to come from higher order component. So let me just wrap this component with counter HOC. Now with counter is taking mouse over counter as input. Let's just import it, and the button will now call increment method coming from props. Okay, we have to add props here. Call props dot increment and save it. Now we have the component ready. So if I refresh, I see the count values set to 0, and if I mouse over, the count value is incrementing. So we have moved the comment code to HOC, and we applied that HOC in these two components and made these two components simple. So this is how higher order components will be used. We hard-coded button names here in these components. Let us assume that these button names are coming as properties to these components. Let me go to app.js, add a property called name, and this will hold the name of the button. So here it is click counter, and here it is mouse over counter. And instead of hard coding, I'll just make it props.name and copy the same thing in mouse over component as well. Save it. Look at the screen here. I see the buttons and the count value, but the name of the button is not displayed. This is because the props are sent to the original component, and this original component is wrapped in the HOC. This HOC will return a new component altogether. In that new component, we are making use of original component, but we are passing only one prop, which is the method provided by the new component. So what happens is all the previous props which this original component has will be lost, and only the props which are sent in this new component will be preserved and can be made use of. That's the reason if I click on this button or mouse over on this button, this increment method would work, but not the name property, because this name property is not passed into the original component. All the props which are originally passed to the actual component will be lost. To preserve that, what we have to do here is we have to pass those props to the new component as well. Along with the newly added props, we need to make sure that we pass the previous props as well. And we don't know what the original component props are, right? So we just use the spread operator and pass the original props in this manner. Now we see the names on these buttons coming from these props which we added in the app.js component. So make sure when you create a HOC, you pass the original props along with the newly added props. Another interesting thing is static methods should be explicitly copied to the new component before returning it from HOC. For example, I have a static method in mouse over component. And how do we add the static method? We directly add it to the component. For example, I want a static method called add, which would take two parameters, and that function would return the sum of those two parameters. So this add is going to be a function which would take two parameters and returns the sum of those values. Now, if I try to access, I can access this add anywhere I import this mouse over component. I'll try to console log the add result of add method. So mouse over counter dot add 1 comma 2, and what I'm expecting to see here is a log which would give me the sum of these two values. So let me open the developer tools, move to console, and I see an error here. Add is not a function. This is because this add is a static method of the original component, and in HOC, static methods will not be copied. You have to explicitly copy before returning the new component. So new component dot add equals original component dot add. We are just copying the static method of original component to the new component. Now, if I just refresh, I see the console log here. 1 plus 2 is 3. So remember, static methods will not be copied by default. You have to copy them explicitly inside HOC before returning the new component. If you use any ref keyword inside this click counter or mouse over counters, ref keywords will also be not passed to the new component. In order to resolve that, we need to use forward ref API, which is altogether a different concept, which we are not going to cover in this video. Just for the future reference, I want to mention that the ref keywords will not be added to the new component. So this is all about higher order components in React. We have seen examples and understood how we can make our code reusable. Hope this concept is clear, and if you like the content, please like, share and subscribe to InterviewPro. Thank you.